Snow doesn't fall in ironwood. It waits. It hung in the frozen air the night they led Wren Hale barefoot across the Judgment Garden. Her wrists still ringed where the chains had bitten. The whole pack had come to watch her lie. That was the story they'd been fed. That the healer had tricked their king. That the bond he'd once knelt for in the snow was something she had stitched together out of ambition and smoke. And there he stood, Roman Cain, the alpha whose wolf had bowed to her in the bloodwood snow, now looking everywhere in that garden except at her face. She knew that look. It was the look of a man who had already decided what he needed to forget. Above them, the silver cage waited under a full and patient moon. They said it could taste a false bond. Burn the lie right out of a woman's blood by dawn. But here is what no one in that garden knew. Not the nobles in their white fur. Not the king with frost in his jaw. Not even the woman smiling so softly at his side. The cage was never built to punish a liar. It was built to find a thief. And tonight, under that cold, watching light, it was finally going to start looking. The cold had a scent all its own. Wren Hale had known it long before this night. The way frost carried iron and pine and something older underneath, like the breath of the land itself, rising up through the snow. She was breathing it now in shallow pulls. Deeper hurt too much. Blood had soaked through the wool at her side, warmed it for a while, then let it go cold again. She did not look at the wound. Looking made it real. And real was a thing she could not afford right now. Not with the pup shivering against her chest. The little wolf was dying. She could feel it in the way its heartbeat stumbled under her palm. Too fast, then frighteningly slow. Poison did that. She had smelled it the moment she found him, that sweet rot clinging to his fur. The kind of scent that meant someone had wanted this creature gone and had not cared how long it suffered. So she had stayed. A healer stays. That was the whole of it. She pressed 2 fingers to the soft place beneath his jaw and hummed something low, the way she had hummed to frighten things her whole life. Her voice came out cracked and quiet in the dark. "Easy now," she whispered. "You are not alone. Not yet." The forest answered with silence. Then the silence changed. It was not a sound exactly. It was a pressure. The air thickened the way it does before lightning, and every hair on her arms lifted at once. The pines stopped their soft creaking. Even the snow seemed to hold still. Something was watching her. Wren did not run. She could not have run if she wanted to. But there was more to it than the wound. She had spent her life among wild things. And wild things did not respect fear. They respected stillness. So she stayed where she was, curved over the dying pup like a wall of warmth. And she lifted her eyes. A shape stood at the edge of the clearing. A wolf, but not like any wolf the lowland villages told stories about. This one was enormous, black as the space between stars. Its shoulders level with her own, even though she sat upright. Snow gathered on the broad ridge of its back and did not melt. Its eyes caught the moonlight and threw it back, pale gold, ancient, terribly aware. It was looking at her the way a judgment looks at the accused. And behind it, between the trees, came the man. Roman Cain had come to the Bloodwood Forest to kill a trespasser. That was the report that had reached him. A stranger on Ironwood land near the border the rival packs had bled over for generations. His scouts had said nothing of a woman, nothing of blood in the snow, nothing of the low, broken humming that had reached his wolf first and pulled the beast forward faster than his own boots could follow. He did not understand it. His wolf did not stop for the wounded. It did not soften for strangers. It was the thing that had kept Ironwood standing through 3 brutal winters of border raids, and it had never once knelt to anything that was not stronger than itself. Yet, here it was, standing in front of this woman, not lunging, not circling, just watching her, the way it watched the moon. And then there was the scent. It was the scent that undid him. Roman had trained his whole life to read scent the way other men read faces. Fear had a sourness. Lies had a metallic edge. Most strangers, caught and cornered, reeked of both at once. This woman smelled of none of it. She smelled of crushed winter herbs and wood smoke and clean snow. And underneath all of that, something that made his chest tighten without permission. Something warm. Something his wolf seemed to recognize before his mind could argue. He stepped into the clearing, sword already drawn, and his voice came out harder than he meant it to. "You are on protected ground." The woman did not flinch. She looked up at him, blood on her lips, her dark hair loose and tangled with frost, and she did the last thing he expected. She tightened her arms around the dying animal and turned her body to shield it. Not herself. It. For one long breath, no one moved. Ren looked at the king, because she knew now that this was a king, or something close to one. She could see it in the way the wolf stood at his side like a second crown. She could see it in his armor, dark and worn and built for war. She could see it in his eyes, gray and exhausted, the eyes of a man who had stopped expecting the world to surprise him. She was going to die here. She understood that with a strange, floating calm. So she spent her last clear thought on the only thing that mattered. "If you are going to kill me," she said, and her voice did not shake, "feed the pup first." The king went very still. "He has done nothing wrong," she went on, softer now. "He was poisoned and left to suffer. He is not your enemy. He is just small, and someone decided small things do not matter." She swallowed. "They are wrong about that. They are always wrong about that." Roman stared at her. In all his years, no one cornered by his blade had ever asked him to spare something else first. They begged for their own lives. Every time. That was the shape of fear, the oldest shape there was. But this woman, bleeding into the snow, with the cold already climbing into her fingers, had not asked him for a single thing for herself. She had asked for the wolf, and his own wolf, his great black beast that bowed to nothing, lowered its head. Roman felt it happen inside his own chest, like a door swinging open in a house he thought he knew. The wolf walked forward, slow, deliberate. It crossed the clearing and lowered its enormous muzzle until it was level with the woman, until its warm breath stirred the loose strands of her hair, and then it pressed its head gently, so gently, against her shoulder. A bow. His wolf was bowing to her, not to her strength. She had none left, not to her blood. She was a stranger, low-born by the look of her plain healer's cloak. The beast was bowing to her mercy, to the thing in her that had chosen a dying creature over her own last breath. Roman lowered the sword without deciding to. Something passed between them in that moment. He would spend a long time afterward trying to name it, and failing. It was not desire, though desire would come later, slow and aching and impossible to refuse. It was not duty. It was something quieter and far more dangerous. It was recognition, as if some part of him that had been clenched shut his entire life had finally, in a clearing full of snow and blood, found a reason to open. The woman watched the wolf touch her shoulder, and her composure cracked at last. Not from fear, from the unbearable gentleness of being met when she had braced for the blade. A single tear slipped down her cheek and froze halfway. "Please," she whispered, and this time it was not for the wolf. It was for the small wild hope blooming somewhere under her ribs. He is still breathing. There is still time. Roman knelt in the snow in front of her, a king kneeling, to a stranger. He did not know her name yet. He did not know that the whole machinery of his court would soon turn against this exact moment and try to carve it out of him like rot from a wound. He did not know that one day he would stand in a frozen garden and pretend he had never knelt at all. He only knew that something gold and warm and living had just stretched between his heart and hers, thin as a thread, bright as a struck match. He reached for the pup. His fingers brushed her wrist as he did, and they both went still at the touch, at the heat of it, the strange rightness of it. "What is your name?" he said. And Wren Hale, half frozen, half undone, looked into the eyes of the man who would one day break her, and answered, "Wren." The thread between them pulled tight and held. The pup lived. That was the first thing the pack learned about Wren Hale, that she had pulled a poisoned creature back from the edge with nothing but her hands and her stubbornness and a satchel of crushed winter herbs. The second thing they learned was harder to say out loud. The king's wolf had chosen her. Many weeks had passed since the bloodwood clearing, long enough for her wound to close into a pale seam along her ribs, long enough for the cold months to settle their full weight over ironwood, for the great hall to fill with the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat and melting snow dripping from 100 boots, long enough that the servants had stopped staring when she passed. Now they bowed. Wren still could not get used to it. She would be crossing the upper gallery with an armful of dried medicine bundles, her sleeves pushed up, her mind on a fevered child in the lower wing. And a guard twice her size would lower his head and murmur a word she had never thought to hear directed at herself. Luna. Not crowned, not fully seated. The court was careful to remind everyone of that. She wore a silver mantle across her shoulders that was given on loan, not granted, a thing that could be taken back. The old wolves called her provisional, as if she were a season that had not yet decided to stay. But they lowered their heads, and that, in a place like this, meant something close to a miracle. She knew what she was, and what she was not. She was a healer from a lowland village no noble in this hall could find on a map. She had calluses on her hands, and dirt under her nails, and a way of speaking to frightened animals that the high-born ladies found charming when they were feeling generous and unsettling when they were not. She was not one of them. She felt it most at the long table when the conversation turned to bloodlines and treaties and the careful arithmetic of which house owed which. The talk would flow easily, and then it would reach her, and it would slow, the way a stream slows when it meets a stone. The ladies in their white furs would smile at her with their mouths and study her with their eyes. The lords would ask her opinion on matters of the body, on poultices and fevers, because that was a thing a healer was allowed to know. And then they would turn back to the matters of power as though she had left the room. Wren let them. She had not come here for their approval. She had come because a black wolf had bowed to her in the snow, and because the man behind that wolf had knelt, and because something gold had stretched between them that night and refused to let go. She had come for him, even if she was still learning how to say so. He found her that evening in the herb room off the lower gallery. It was the warmest corner of the whole cold fortress, low-ceilinged, lit by a single banked fire, the air thick with the green smell of drying things. Bundles of yarrow and willow bark hung from the rafters. A pot of something dark simmered low over the coals. Roman Kane stood in the doorway and let himself, for one moment, simply watch her. She had not heard him come in. She rarely did. He moved quietly for a man his size, a habit beaten into him by years of border patrols, and he had learned that if he stood still long enough, the world would show him things it hid from louder men. It was showing him her now. Wren sat on a low stool with her back half turned, her dark hair coming loose from its knot, grinding something in a stone bowl with slow, certain strokes. Firelight moved along the curve of her cheek. The sleeves of her plain dress were pushed up past her elbows, and her forearms were strong and scarred and beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with the careful, painted beauty of his court. His wolf stirred under his skin, the way it always did when she was near. It was a feeling he had spent his entire life without, and now could not imagine living without again. A loosening. A warmth that started behind his ribs and spread outward, slow as honey. For a man who had been taught from boyhood that softness was a wound waiting to be exploited, it was terrifying. He did not understand how she did it. He only knew that the cold inside him, the cold he had carried so long he had stopped noticing it, went quiet when she was in the room. "You are staring," Wren said without turning around. The corner of his mouth moved. "You can smell me? I can always smell you." She set down the pestle and finally looked at him, and the firelight caught her eyes. "Smoke and steel and that bitter thing you carry. Worry. You always smell like worry, Roman." It still startled him a little, the way she said his name, plainly, like a person, and not a position. In the great hall they called him many things. My king, my lord, Alpha. The names sat on him like armor, heavy and necessary and cold. She called him Roman. He crossed the small room and lowered himself onto the bench beside her, close enough that the warmth of her reached him before her shoulder did. She did not move away. That was the thing about her that took the breath out of him every time. She did not shrink. She had been shrunk at, dismissed, talked over, and still she sat there with her spine straight and her chin level, as if the whole weight of his court could not press her smaller. "The lower wing fever," he said. "The child. Broke last night." A tired smile. "She will run her mother ragged by spring." "Good." They sat in the quiet for a while. The fire ticked. Somewhere far off a wolf called and another answered. Then Roman did a thing he had been circling for weeks without the courage to land on. He reached over, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and he took her hand. Wren went very still. His hand was enormous around hers, calloused and warm, the hand of a man who had held a sword far more often than he had held anything gentle. He turned her palm over as though it were something rare. His thumb traced the line of a scar there, an old burn from some long-forgotten kettle, and the touch sent a slow heat climbing up the inside of her arm. She did not breathe. Slow burn was a thing she understood from her own craft. Some medicines worked all at once, a flood, a fever breaking. Others worked over long patient days, gathering under the skin until one morning you woke and realized you had been healing the whole time without noticing. This was the second kind. It had been building since the clearing, since the bow. Since the first night he had walked her back to the fortress with the pup tucked against his chest and his cloak around her shoulders, and the smell of him soaking into the wool, wood smoke and snow and something underneath that her own wolf, faint as it was, had answered to. And now his thumb was tracing her palm, and his head was bowed close to hers, and she could feel the warmth coming off his skin in waves. "Wren," he said, low, rough. In the hall they call you provisional." His jaw tightened. She felt it more than saw it. "As though you are a thing being tried. As though my wolf bowing to you in the snow was a matter for committee. It is to them. It is not." He lifted his eyes to hers, and there was a heat in them she had only glimpsed before, banked carefully, like the fire in the corner. "Not to me." Her heart was doing something complicated in her chest. "Then what am I to you?" she said, "when the doors are closed and there is no committee?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to the center of her palm, to the very scar he had been tracing, and the heat of his lips against that tender skin made her breath catch hard in her throat. "My Luna," he said against her hand. "Not provisional, not on loan." His breath was warm. "Mine, the way the moon belongs to the night and asks no one's permission." It was the first time he had said it. Not in the hall, in front of the council, where the words would have been a decree and a battle and 100 political consequences. Here, in the warm dark, to her alone. Wren felt the words go through her like the first sip of something strong, heat blooming all the way down. She turned her hand in his so their fingers laced, scarred palm to scarred palm, and she leaned in until her forehead rested against his. They stayed like that, not kissing, not yet, just breathing the same warm air, his hand cradling hers, the firelight painting them both in gold, his scent wrapped around her, and hers around him, and somewhere beneath their joined hands, the thin gold thread that had stretched between them in the snow pulled tight and sang. "Say it again," she whispered. "My Luna." Again. "Mine." His other hand rose to the side of her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone with a tenderness that did not match the size of him at all. "And I am yours, whatever the hall decides, whatever it costs." He should not have said that last part. He would remember it later, in a frozen garden, with a different word in his mouth. He would remember the way she had smiled against his forehead, trusting him completely, and the memory would carve him hollow. But he did not know that yet. In that moment, he believed every word. The cost came 3 days later. It came the way cold comes into a house. Not all at once, but through a single open door. The horn sounded at the gate near dusk. A party from the northern court, banners stiff with frost, riders in a pale fur. The hall filled with the scrape of boots and the hush of a court rearranging itself for important guests. And at the center of the party, stepping down from a white horse as though the snow had laid itself out for her arrival, came a woman Wren had never seen. She was beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful. Pale golden hair braided through with silver thread, a white cloak that did not carry a single mark of the road. A stillness to her, a composure so complete it made everyone around her look slightly disheveled by comparison. When she moved, the court moved with her, the way iron filings turned toward a lodestone. Roman went rigid beside Wren. "Vivienne," he said. The name came out flat. "Thorn." The woman crossed the hall and stopped before them, and her gaze passed over Wren once, quick and total, the way a buyer assesses a horse. Then she smiled, and the smile was warm, and that was the most frightening thing about it. "My king." She inclined her head, perfectly. "Forgive the cold welcome. The northern roads do not forgive a late start." Her eyes slid back to Wren, and the warmth in them did not waver at all. "And this must be the healer. The whole north speaks of her. The lowland girl whose mercy bent an alpha's wolf." A soft laugh. "What a tender story." Wren felt the words land for exactly what they were. A story. Tender. Small. A thing to be cooed over and then set aside. "It is good to meet you," Wren said evenly. "Oh, you as well." Vivienne turned to Roman, and her voice changed. Lower, more intimate. The voice of someone resuming a long conversation rather than beginning a new one. "I would not have come in such haste, but the matter could not wait for spring." From within her white cloak she drew a scroll. It was old, the kind of old that smelled of dust and dried ink and something faintly bitter underneath. A scent that made the faint wolf in Wren's blood prickle with unease before her mind understood why. "The Northern Archives," Vivienne said softly, "keep prophecies the lowland villages have long forgotten." She unrolled it with great care, as though it might cut her. "And one of them, my king, concerns you. It concerns this hall, and I am afraid it concerns her." The whole court leaned in. Roman's hand found Wren's under the table and held it, hidden, fierce. Vivienne read, "The king's true mate will bend the moon and break the crown." The words fell into the warm hall and turned it cold. For a long moment no one spoke. The fire popped. The northern lords watched the king's face. The ladies in white watched Wren's. And Vivienne Thorn stood at the center of it all, with the old scroll in her gloved hands and her gentle, terrible smile, having said nothing untrue and changed everything. Wren felt the room begin, very quietly, to turn against her, and under the table she felt Roman's grip tighten, and then, for just one breath, falter. He caught himself at once, but she had felt it, that first small loosening, that first thread of doubt slipping in through the open door. And though neither of them could name it yet, that was where the cutting began. It began so quietly that Wren almost convinced herself she had imagined it. A look, one look, across the great hall, on an ordinary gray morning. She had come in from the lower wing with snow still melting in her hair, and she had found Roman at the high table with the maps spread before him. And when she stepped into the room, he had glanced up the way he always did, the way his whole body had learned to turn toward her like a plant toward light. But this time something flickered behind his eyes, a hesitation, half a heartbeat where he looked at her and did not seem entirely certain what he was looking at, as though her face was a word on the tip of his tongue, as though some part of him had reached for her and closed around empty air. It passed at once. He smiled. He said her name, but Wren had spent her life reading the small signs that bodies give before the mind admits anything is wrong. A change in breath, a tightness around the eyes, the first faint, sour note in a wound that looked clean. And she had just seen the first faint note in him. She told herself it was exhaustion. The court was a heavy thing to carry, and he carried it alone. The northern guests had stayed on far past welcome, and every night the hall filled with talk of treaties and borders, and the old prophecy that would not stop circling the room like smoke. So she said nothing. She made him a tea of valerian and skullcap and pressed the warm cup into his hands herself, and she watched him drink it, and she let herself believe that a tired man simply forgets things, but it happened again, and then again. For Roman, the wrongness lived in his wolf. He had no words for it. That was the worst part. He was a man who had spent his whole life trusting the beast under his skin more than he trusted any counsel or any map. The wolf had never lied to him. It had found enemies in the dark and friends in the crowd, and it had, on one snowbound night in the bloodwood forest, found her. Now the wolf was searching. He would catch her scent in a corridor, that warm green smell of crushed herbs and wood smoke that had once steadied him like a hand on the chest. And the wolf would lift its head, eager, certain, and then it would lose the thread. Right in the middle of breathing her in, the scent would thin, would fray at the edges, would slip through the beast's grasp like water through fingers. And the wolf would turn in a slow, agitated circle inside him, hackles raised, growling low at nothing, hunting for something it had been told was right there and could no longer find. It frightened him in a way he would not say aloud. A king did not admit that his own wolf had begun to go blind. Vivienne Thorne was always nearby when it happened. Wren noticed that too, though she hated herself a little for the noticing. It felt small. It felt like the kind of jealousy the ladies in white expected of a lowland girl who had climbed too high. But the pattern was there. When Roman's eyes clouded, Vivienne was in the room. When his wolf turned its restless circle, Vivienne was close. She had a way of drifting to the king's side at exactly the moments his attention faltered. A soft word ready, a steadying presence, the picture of a loyal friend supporting a tired ruler. And at her wrist, beneath the white fur, she wore a thin silver bracelet. A small charm hung from it, a crescent, no larger than a fingernail. Wren only ever caught it in glimpses, a flash of cold light when Vivienne lifted her hand, a glint that seemed to catch the moon even when there was no moon to catch. Each time she saw it, the faint wolf in her own blood prickled and went uneasy, the way an animal goes uneasy before a storm it cannot yet smell. She did not know what it meant. She only knew that her body did not trust it. The deepening came on a night the wind would not stop. It threw itself against the fortress walls and howled in the chimneys, and Wren could not sleep. So she went to the herb room to work, because her hands always knew what to do, even when the rest of her did not. Roman found her there past midnight. He looked terrible, hollowed out. The lines around his eyes had gone deep, and his shoulders carried a weight she could see but not lift. He did not speak. He crossed the small warm room, and he simply gathered her against his chest, his arms closing around her, his face buried in her hair, breathing her in like a man surfacing from deep water. Wren held him. "You are not sleeping," she said softly into his shirt. "No." "Your wolf." He went still against her. For a long moment the only sound was the fire and the wind. "It will not settle," he admitted at last, his voice low and rough and stripped of all its court armor. "It hunts the whole night through, for something it cannot name." His arms tightened. "Except when you are close. When you are close, it almost finds it. And then it loses the trail again. And I do not understand why. And it is making me afraid, Wren. And I do not say that word easily." She drew back just enough to take his face in her hands. His skin was warm. His eyes in the firelight were the gray of a winter sky just before it gives up its snow. And in that moment, he was not a king at all. He was just a man who had been cold his whole life and had found one warm room and was watching the door blow open. "Then let me be close," she said. She rose onto her toes, and she kissed him. It was not their first kiss, but it was the first one with grief in it. His mouth was gentle, and then it was not gentle, and his hands came up into her hair and held her like something he was afraid to lose. She could feel the desperation under it. The hunger of a man trying to memorize a scent before it faded. The slow burn that had built between them for so long flared bright and aching, and she pressed closer, and he made a low sound against her mouth that she felt all the way down to her bones. For a few breaths there was no prophecy, no counsel, no crescent charm, no clouding in his eyes. There was only his hands and her hands, and the warm dark and the gold thread between them pulling so taut it nearly sang. And then, in the middle of it, she felt him go still. It was a terrible stillness. He drew back just an inch, and he looked at her. And there it was again. The flicker, the hesitation. For one endless, awful heartbeat, the man holding her looked at her face as though he had forgotten, in the space of a kiss, exactly who he was kissing. "Roman," she whispered. His brow furrowed. His eyes searched hers. And the warmth that had been pouring off him a moment before pulled back, like a tide going out, leaving her standing in sudden cold. "Wren," he said, but there had been a gap before her name, a space where the certainty used to be, and they both heard it. She did not weep until she was alone, and even then she did not weep long, because there was work to do, and work had carried her through harder winters than this one. But something had shifted in her chest that night, some quiet door closing, and she understood with a healer's grim clarity that whatever was wrong with him, it was getting worse. She just did not yet know it was being done to him on purpose. The external threat did not come dressed as a threat. It came as paper. Wren had taken to visiting the lower villages when she could, the way she always had, because a healer who stays only in the warm halls forgets what cold does to the poor. And what she found in those villages, as the deep months wore on, made her stomach turn. They were starving. Not all of them. Not yet. But the granaries that should have been full were running thin, and the wagons that should have carried grain down from the noble stores had stopped coming. And the children she examined had the hollow cheeks and the two bright eyes that no poultice could mend. She asked questions. She was good at questions. and the answers, when she put them side by side, formed a shape she did not want to see. The grain had not vanished. It had moved. Up, not down. Into the storehouses of the great houses, against some coming season of leverage. Taxed out of the mouths of villages that could least afford it, under emergency measures the council had quietly approved, while the court was busy whispering about prophecies. Wren copied the ledgers with her own hand, the numbers, the dates, the names of the storehouses. She did not trust herself to remember it all, and she did not trust the court to let her see it twice. And then she carried the whole grim record up to the high table, into the heart of the council, and she asked to be heard. The hall went quiet when she stepped forward. Roman sat at the head of the long table. Vivienne sat near him now, as she always seemed to these days, her white cloak pooled around her chair. And among the council was the gray-robed counselor they all deferred to, an old man named Mercer with a soft voice and a softer smile and eyes that missed nothing. Wren laid the ledger on the table. "The lower villages are starving," she said, plainly, the way she said everything. "The grain that should feed them has been moved into noble stores. The winter roads will close within weeks. If the grain does not go down before they do, people will die." She looked at Roman, not as a maybe, as a certainty. "I have seen the children. I am telling you, they will die." For one moment, the old Roman surfaced. She saw him reach for the ledger. She saw his eyes sharpen, the king who had once knelt in the snow for a dying pup leaning toward the open pages, ready to read, ready to act. And then Vivienne shifted in her seat. Her hand rose just slightly. The white fur of her sleeve fell back, and the small silver crescent at her wrist caught the firelight and threw it, cold and bright, across the table. Roman's eyes clouded. His hand stopped halfway to the ledger and drew back. Wren felt the moment go wrong the way you feel a stair give way beneath your foot. "My king," Mercer said gently into the silence. His voice was kind. That was what made it dangerous. The healer means well. No one doubts her tender heart. A pause waited just so. But she is not of the council. She does not understand the leverage these stores represent. The northern houses watch our every move. To empty our granaries now, on the word of a lowland girl who is grown, very dear to you, it would look like weakness. It would look like a king who can be moved by a soft voice in his ear. Vivienne laid one gloved hand near Roman's arm, not touching, just near. "He only worries for you," she murmured to Wren with that same warm and terrible gentleness. "We all do. A king whose judgment bends so easily for one person, that is not safety. That is a door left open." Wren looked at Roman. Roman. Just his name. A plea folded into one word. "Read it, please. Forget who is saying it. Just read the numbers." He looked at the ledger, he looked at her, and his eyes, gray and tired and clouded with something he could not see, slid away. "The matter will be reviewed," he said. His voice was flat, distant, a king's voice, not a man's. "When the council has time, the northern situation takes precedence." "They do not have until the council has time," Wren said. "The petition is noted." He did not look at her again. "That is all. 3 villagers died before the roads closed. An old man, a young mother, and the child whose fever Wren had broken in the autumn, the one she had said would run her mother ragged by spring. There would be no spring for her. Wren learned it from a runner who came up through the snow half frozen and wept as he told her, and she sat down very slowly on the cold stone floor of the herb room among the hanging bundles and the banked fire, and she did not cry. She had passed crying. What she felt was older and quieter and far more frightening. A kind of clarity. The clarity of a woman watching the people she came to help die for the crime of being inconvenient, while the man who could have saved them sat clouded and silent at a table where her voice did not count. She had been right. That was the thing they would never forgive her for. Because here is how a court works. When a lowland healer warns of starvation and is ignored and the starvation comes, the court does not say, "She was right. We should have listened." The court says, "How did she know? How did she know, unless she had a hand in it? How did she know, unless there was something unnatural in her? How did she know, unless the prophecy was true?" And here was the proof. A woman whose very rightness bent the king and unsettled the order of things. The king's true mate will bend the moon and break the crown. She had bent his judgment, had she not? She had stood at the council table and tried to turn the whole machinery of the realm with nothing but a ledger and a soft, certain voice. And 3 deaths later, she had been proven correct, which only made her more dangerous, because a woman who is right is so much harder to dismiss than a woman who is wrong. By the next gathering, the word had taken root in every corner of the hall. Dangerous. It followed her down the corridors now, in the lowered voices, in the eyes that slid away. The servants still bowed, but they bowed faster, and they did not meet her gaze. The ladies in white watched her with something that was no longer quite disdain. It had sharpened into fear, and through it all, Vivienne Thorne was kindness itself. She defended Wren in council, gently, in ways that did more harm than any attack. "She is not dangerous," Vivienne would say, with her warm and sorrowful smile. "She is simply unaware of her own effect. We must protect her from the consequences of her own gifts. We must protect the king most of all." Each word a thread. Each thread pulled a little tighter. And at her wrist, the small silver crescent hung quiet, catching the light only when she chose, only when she lifted her hand at exactly the moment the king's eyes needed to cloud. Wren stood alone at a high window one night, looking out over the white and frozen dark, and she let herself, for one moment, feel the full weight of it. The man she loved was forgetting her by inches. The people she had tried to save were dead, and the whole great machine of the court had quietly decided that she was the danger, when she could feel in her bones, in the faint and fading wolf in her own blood, that something was being done to her, around her, against her. Something with a shape she could almost see, and could not yet name. She pressed her hand flat against the cold glass. Somewhere below, a wolf called out into the night. Long, searching, grieving. She knew that voice. It was his wolf, hunting through the dark for a scent it could no longer find. And Wren Hale stood at the window with her palm against the cold, and understood that the cutting had already begun, and that she was running out of time to learn who was holding the blade. The garden had not been built for mercy. Wren Hale understood that the moment they led her through the iron gate, and the cold closed over her like water, it lay beyond the fortress walls, a circle of pale stone, open to the sky, ringed by black trees that had surrendered their leaves long ago. Snow clung to every branch and did not fall. Silver lanterns swung in the frozen wind, throwing a light that gave no warmth at all. And above it all hung the full moon, enormous and patient, looking straight down into the heart of the place, as though it had been waiting a very long time for this exact night. At the center of the circle stood the cage. It was a beautiful, terrible thing. Bars thin as ribs, bright as drawn blades, woven from some old silver that seemed to drink the moonlight and hold it deep inside. It hung suspended on a ring of carved stone, and the runes beneath it slept, dark and patient, waiting for a body to wake them. They said it could taste a false bond. They said it had hung above this garden longer than any living wolf could remember. That no woman accused of false matecraft had ever walked out of it, with her name still her own. If her bond was true, the silver opened by dawn. If it was false, the bars burned her scent out of the world, and she left it unclaimed, unremembered, ruined before the whole pack. And tonight, it was waiting for her. The court had come to watch. Of course they had. The lords stood beneath their wolf banners, stiff with frost, their faces arranged into solemn lines that did not quite hide the hunger underneath. The ladies in white fur gathered on the high terraces above the circle, leaning forward over the marble rail, wearing pity on their mouths and something far older and hungrier in their eyes. This was theater to them, the fall of the lowland girl who had climbed too high, the tender story, ending the way tender stories about poor women always seem to end in halls like this one, with the woman on her knees and the hall well fed. Wren stood barefoot on the frozen stone. She wore only a plain ivory shift, and the cold climbed into the soles of her feet and up through her bones until her teeth ached with it. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders. Her wrists were ringed and raw, where the ceremonial chains had bitten through the long walk here. She did not let any of it bend her. She had decided that much, somewhere in the long, sleepless dark before they came for her. Whatever they took from her tonight, and she suspected they meant to take everything, they would not take the way she stood. So she stood straight, and she breathed the iron cold, and she waited. The accusation was read aloud by Mercer. He had a soft voice, the old counselor, gentle as wool, the kind of voice that sounded like comfort right up until the moment you understood the words it was shaping. He unrolled his scroll without hurry. He let the silence build. And then he spoke into it. False matecraft. Unlawful influence over the royal wolf. Manipulation of the king's own bond sense. The words drifted out across the garden, and the court murmured and shifted like a single, uneasy animal. Somewhere on the high terrace, a woman laughed, low and bright, and tried to swallow it back too late. "I never manipulated him," Wren said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the frozen air, clear, unhurried, and the murmuring stilled to hear it. And it was then that Vivienne Thorne stepped forward. She came to the edge of the judgment stairs wrapped in white fur, her pale gold hair braided through with silver thread, her gloved hands folded before her. Her face was a study in sorrow, perfectly composed, beautiful the way a blade is beautiful. No one wishes to shame you, Wren. So gentle, so warm it made the cold worse. We are heartbroken, all of us. You have done such tender work in the lower wing. But the moon is fair, and the moon cannot be charmed. If your bond is true, The cage will say so, and you will walk free by morning. And every soul in this garden will beg your forgiveness on their knees, a soft, mournful breath. If your bond was true. Wren looked at her, and she said the thing she had been turning over for weeks, the thing her own fading wolf had been trying to whisper to her all along, from somewhere deep and going cold. And if someone cut the bond, she said slowly, before the moon could ever judge it. For one breath, just one, something moved across Vivian's lovely face. A crack, a flicker, there and gone, fast as a fish under ice. But Wren saw it, and from the corner of her eye, she saw Roman see it too. His gaze sharpened. His head turned a fraction toward Vivian, some buried instinct dragging itself up through the fog in his eyes, clawing toward the surface. Then Vivian's gloved fingers brushed the silver bracelet at her wrist. The small crescent charm flashed once, cold and bright, in the moonlight. And Roman looked away. The movement was so small, just a king turning his head. But Wren felt something break inside her at the sight of it. For Roman Kane, the whole night was happening behind glass. That was the only way he could later name it, to himself, in the long ruin of the hours that came after. He stood there in his black armor, with the silver crown cold against his dark hair, and he watched a woman he was certain he loved be led toward a cage that ate women alive. And he could not make himself reach for her. Every time he tried, the fog came down. It rolled across his mind like winter weather, gray and thick and total. And behind it, his wolf paced and snarled and threw itself against the inside of his ribs. The beast was frantic, grieving, hunting through the dark of him for a scent that should have been the easiest thing in all the world to find. The warm green scent that had once steadied him like a hand laid flat against the chest, and finding only a clean, cold absence where it used to live. He looked at her face. He knew that face. He knew the pale seam of the scar along her ribs and the calluses worn into her palms, and the way she said his name, plainly, like he was a person and not a position. He knew she had knelt in the bloodwood snow over a dying creature and asked him to feed it before he killed her. And still he could not feel the thread, the gold thread that had stretched between them in the forest. He reached for it now, inside himself, the way a man reaches in pitch, dark for a wall he knows is there. And his hand closed on nothing. So he told himself the prophecy was true. He told himself the bond had always been false, a thing she had stitched out of ambition and smoke, because that lie was easier. So much easier than standing before the whole court and admitting that the empty place where she used to live inside him felt exactly like grief. He descended one step alone. "Hail," he said, and for one heartbeat, looking at her standing barefoot and unbowed in the silver light, the fog thinned. He saw the forest, blood on her lips, a dying pup in her arms, his own great wolf lowering its head before the simple mercy in her. He felt, for one impossible instant, the warmth come flooding back into the cold rooms of himself, every door swinging open at once. And then Vivian's crescent flashed again at the edge of his sight, and the crown came down over his mind like a lid sealing a well. "I reject your claim upon my wolf," Roman said. The words left his mouth like water poured out into the snow. "If the moon finds truth in you, let it answer. And if not, let this hall be freed of a false bond, and of the woman who carried it. Ren did not cry. He would carry that for the rest of his life. She stood barefoot on the frozen stone with the entire court leaning in to feast on her ruin, and she lifted her chin, and she refused to give them the tears they had dressed up and come out into the cold to see. She only looked at him, and in her eyes there was no hatred. That would have been bearable. Hatred he could have stood against. What was in her eyes was so much worse. It was the look of a woman watching a stranger walk around inside the skin of the man she loved. They led her into the cage. The door opened without a single hand touching it. The air inside smelled of frost and old silver and something underneath it all, faint and bitter, like prayers that had been forgotten so long they had gone to dust. Ren stepped onto the carved stone circle. Beneath her bare feet, the runes woke. They glowed up at her, a soft and terrible blue, climbing the inside of the cage like frost spreading across a window. And then the bars closed around her with a sound like a quiet verdict being read into a still room. The moon looked down, and the trial began. At first, the cage did nothing but freeze her breath. She stood in the cold and the silver light, and the court waited, and the long first hour stretched out beneath the patient moon until her lips had gone numb and her shivering had stopped, which she knew, with a healer's grim awareness, was not a good sign. Then the bars began to warm. It was the strangest thing she had ever felt. The silver did not burn her. Not yet. Instead it reached. She felt it enter her skin, slide into her hair, sink down into her blood, slow and searching, patient as cold water finding every hidden crack in stone. And as it moved through her, it took her memories with it. It lifted them up into the moonlight one by one, turning each one over, tasting it, weighing it for the lie. The bloodwood forest, the red branches, the snow soaking warm with her own blood, and then going cold. The dying pup against her chest, his stumbling little heart under her palm. The first time the great black wolf crossed the clearing and lowered its enormous head to her shoulder, its warm breath stirring her hair. The herb room, low and gold and thick with the green smell of drying things. His thumb tracing the old burn scar on her palm, slow, like she was something rare. His mouth against that scar. My Luna. Not provisional, not on loan. Mine. The kiss with grief folded into it. His hands buried in her hair, holding her like a man trying to memorize a scent before it faded out of the world. The cage moved through all of it. Every moment, every breath she had ever spent loving him. And Ren, standing in the silver light with her whole heart laid bare to the moon and to the watching court, felt the tears finally come. Not from fear, not from the cold, from the unbearable tenderness of reliving every gold moment of the only love she had ever known. While the man who had lived each one of them with her stood outside the bars and called it false. The cage searched her for a lie. It did not find one. What it found instead was worse. Ren felt the exact moment it happened. She felt the silver reach for the bond, felt it go looking for the warm gold thread that should have been rooted deep in the very center of her, the living cord that tied her to him, mate to mate, blood to blood, and close around emptiness. The cage paused. She felt it pause. It had been built to find a false bond and burn it cleanly out of the accused, and instead, it had reached into the deep place where her bond should live, and it had found a clean, deliberate, surgical absence. Her scent was not false. It was missing. Her bond had not been broken by his rejection in the garden tonight. It had been cut long before. Cut so carefully, so cleanly, by such a practiced hand that even the wound had been smoothed over and hidden, made to look like emptiness instead of injury, made to look like a lie instead of a theft. The cage did not know what to do with that. It had been promised a liar to punish. It had found a victim instead. Above the garden, the full moon dimmed. A single wolf, somewhere among the watching lords, whimpered low in its throat and could not stop. "The cage is resisting her," Vivienne said quickly, stepping forward, her smooth voice cutting across the rising unease. "A false bond distorts the moon's judgment. We have all read of it in the old accounts." "Often the case," Mercer nodded, a beat too fast. "The silver struggles against deception. It is no surprise it falters here." Roman said nothing at all, but his gray eyes had fixed on the bars, and they did not look away. Inside the cage, the cold finally won. Wren's knees gave beneath her. She sank down onto the silver floor, slow, and the bars did not burn her. And somehow that frightened the court far more than any scream would have, because the cage had stopped trying to punish her. It had given up its hunt for a crime it simply could not find. She curled on her side on the cold silver, her dark hair spread out across the floor like ink across snow. The blue runes beneath her began to dim, one by one, as though even they had run out of accusations to make. She was so tired. A single tear slipped from the corner of her eye, traced down across the bridge of her nose, and fell. It touched the silver floor. And where it touched, every rune beneath her body went dark at once. Then the cage began to move, not inward, not to crush, upward. The bars loosened from their long prison shape and unfolded toward the open sky, one after another, slow and deliberate, rising like silver branches reaching for the moon they had served for so long. The court cried out as one. Guards drew swords on instinct, then stood frozen, with no enemy to point them at. And on her high terrace, Vivienne Thorne went perfectly, dangerously still. Roman stepped off the judgment stairs, his face stripped clean of every layer of royal control. The cage did not bend itself into a throne. It opened above Wren's sleeping body, into a living sky. Silver stars ignited between the rising bars, dozens of them, hundreds, and they did not scatter at random across the dark. They arranged themselves, with a terrible intention, into shapes, wolves, moons, broken threads, and one long, deliberate line of light that stretched out from the very center of Wren's chest, across the frozen garden, all the way to the chest of the king who had cast her out. That line should have glowed gold, whole, living, unbroken. Instead, it was severed, in 3 places. The breaks glowed red against the silver, raw as fresh wounds, and they pulsed in the cold air with a rhythm that matched no heartbeat in the garden, or matched to. Every alpha in that garden saw it. A mate thread, the truest thing 2 wolves could ever share, the most private bond a body could carry, laid open in silver light above the heads of the entire court. And it had been cut. 3 times, clean and cruel and unmistakable. The court forgot how to breathe. Then the constellation shifted. The stars unmade themselves and remade themselves, sliding into a new shape above the sleeping woman. and a vision bloomed in the night sky for all of them to see. A figure, a basin of moonlit water, a king asleep in a chamber of dark stone, his crown set aside, his face younger and softer in rest than it ever was at court, and a woman standing over it all, in her hand a small silver crescent blade. And as the court watched, frozen, she drew that blade slowly through a glowing golden thread of light, drew it through with the steady, practiced patience of someone who had done such work before, until the thread snapped. The face of the woman in the stars was beautiful, pale gold hair braided through with silver. It was Vivienne Thorne. A sound moved through the court like ice splitting over deep black water. And then the constellation spoke, not in any voice a living throat could shape, in a voice older than the pack, older than the fortress, older than the silver itself. A voice that came down out of the moon and up out of the stone all at once, vast and cold and certain. The cage finds no false mate. The stars burned brighter until the whole garden was washed in silver day. It finds a stolen bond. Wren lay unconscious beneath the living map of silver and grief, small and pale on the floor of the cage, untouched by the very thing that had been built to destroy her. And Roman Cain stood at the edge of the stone circle with one hand pressed hard against his own chest, against the place where the severed thread still pulsed its 3 red wounds into the night. And he looked at her sleeping face, as though his wolf had finally, after all this long blind season, remembered how to see. Behind him, in the trampled snow, his shadow began to change. The wolf rose up out of it, not fully flesh, not fully spirit. A great dark shape with moonlit eyes and silver scars carved deep across its muzzle, wounds that no healer in the fortress had ever been able to explain. It lifted its huge head and looked down through the opened bars at the woman lying still on the silver floor, and it made a sound so broken, so heavy with grief, that every wolf in the garden lowered its head to the snow and could not lift it again. The beast was not angry at her. It had never once been angry at her. It had been grieving her this entire time, hunting the long dark for a scent that had been carved out of the world while its master slept. And now, at last, beneath the cold and watching moon, with the truth burning silver overhead, it had found her again. Roman's breath came ragged. The fog was lifting from him, tearing apart in great gray rags, and underneath it, rising slow and terrible and unstoppable, came the first full understanding of what had been done. To her, to him, to the bond between them that some careful, patient hand had carved away, piece by piece, while he was made to look the other way and call it duty. The constellation hung above them, silver and waiting. The court stood frozen in the cold. Vivienne Thorne did not move at all. And the truth, after so very long in the dark, had only just begun to open its eyes. The constellation did not fade. The court could not bear that. A vision could be argued with. A vision could be called grief, or trickery, or the old silver playing its tricks on frightened minds. But the stars did not flicker and vanish the way a lie does when it is caught. They hung there, steady and silver and merciless, the severed thread pulsing its 3 red wounds above the sleeping woman. And they waited, as though the moon itself had decided it had heard enough, and now intended to be answered. It was Mercer who tried to close the door. Men like him survived by speaking before the truth could finish settling, and he spoke now, his soft voice rising into the frozen hush. Moon distortion, my king. He spread his gray-robed arms, the picture of weary reason. The cage is ancient. Her grief has soaked into the silver. What we see is symbol. Guilt, given shape. It is not testimony. It cannot be. The constellation turned. Every silver star above the cage shifted at once, and they fixed on him, and Mercer's soft voice died in his throat. A new image bloomed in the night sky. The old counselor, standing in a low chapel beside the woman with the crescent blade. A basin of dark water between them, reflecting a sleeping king. Mercer holding the blade out to her, handle first. Mercer pouring black ash over the severed thread when the cutting was done. The accomplice. The hand behind the hand. The stars rearranged themselves into one cold word, written in silver fire above his head. Witnessed. Mercer staggered back a step and said nothing more. He had played his part. The court could see now exactly how small that part had been. He had held the door. He had carried the ash. But the blade had never been his. The blade had belonged to her. Vivienne Thorne stepped down from the judgment stairs. She did not flinch from the stars. That was the frightening thing about her. The thing that had carried her so far. Her white cloak trailed across the snow, and her face, after one terrible moment, recomposed itself into something soft. But the softness now looked like silk laid carefully over a knife. She did not look at Wren's sleeping body. She looked only at Roman. "My king," she said gently, "you are wounded. The cage has reached into you and found the easiest fear a man can carry, and it is wearing that fear like a costume to frighten you." Roman's gray eyes came to her slowly. "The easiest fear," he said. His voice was very quiet. The court had learned by now to be afraid of him when he went quiet. "And what fear is that, Vivienne? That you wronged her." Her voice trembled, just enough to sound human. "That your rejection was not your own. That the pain you caused was pressed into your hand by someone else, and that none of it was your fault." She let the words land soft. It is such a tempting story, when the guilt is too heavy to hold. It lets a man set the whole weight down, and here was the cruelty of it. For Roman, the words went in like a blade slipped between the ribs, because they were not entirely a lie. That was Vivienne's whole art. She never reached for the clean lie. She reached for the true thing and bent it, just slightly, into a shape that served her. And the true thing she reached for now was the deepest fear he carried beneath the crown, the fear that he was weak, that his judgment could be moved by a soft voice and a warm room, that he had nearly lost the northern treaties because he hesitated when Wren wept in council, that he had let a lowland healer with a ledger make him doubt his own counselors, that he had been, in some quiet and shameful way, unmaking himself for her, season by season. A king who feared his own weakness could be made to mistrust any truth that offered him relief. And the truth before him now, that he had been the victim of a theft, that none of this was his doing, offered the sweetest relief of all. He felt himself reach for it. He felt the fog stir at the edges of his mind, eager to roll back in, eager to let him off the hook one more time. "She said someone cut the bond," Roman murmured. "Did she say it before the prophecy was read?" Vivienne answered at once, soft and quick. or after, before the court began to question her place, or after, before your wolf stopped finding her scent, or after. She stepped closer. A drowning woman reaches for any rope, my king. So does a drowning king. The severed thread between them pulsed. Roman flinched, and Vivian, who knew exactly where the wound was, pressed her thumb directly into it. You were becoming unstable, she said with terrible tenderness. You hesitated. You doubted. You let her grief steer your hand at the council table. I watched men who should have knelt begin to wonder if you could still rule yourself. Her voice dropped. I did what I did because no one else had the courage to do it. I steadied your reign. I am still trying to steady it now. And then the constellation answered her, not with words this time, with a falling star. 3 of them broke loose from the silver map and dropped into the snow before the gathered court, and where they struck, images rose up out of the frost. Empty granaries, children with hollow cheeks and 2 bright eyes, tax wagons heavy with grain, rolling up the mountain roads toward the noble stores, while the villages they passed grew thin and quiet and still. The constellation held the images there in the snow for everyone to see, and Roman stared at them, and something in his face went very still, not empty, awake. She brought me this, he said slowly. The ledger, the numbers. She stood at my table and begged me to send the grain before the roads closed. His jaw tightened until the muscle stood out hard along the bone. And I told her the matter would be reviewed. She made you doubt your counsel, Vivian said. That is precisely why she was dangerous. She was right, Roman said. The words struck the court like a slap. 3 of them died, he went on, and his voice had gone rough now, scraped raw. An old man, a young mother, a child whose fever she had broken with her own hands. He looked up from the images in the snow, and he looked at Vivienne, and the fog was gone from his eyes entirely. She was right, and I called her dangerous for it, because being wrong would have been so much more convenient than admitting I had stopped listening. This was the moment the dilemma closed its jaws on him. He stood at the edge of the silver circle with the whole court watching, and he understood that he was standing at the edge of his own ruin, and that he had 2 paths down from it. One path was Vivian's. Take the relief she was offering. Call it all a theft done to him. Be the wronged king, the victim of a scheming woman. Blameless, clean. The court would believe it. They wanted to believe it. It would cost him nothing but the truth. The other path cost everything. Because the constellation had shown the world that Vivian had cut the bond, but it had not yet shown them the rest. It had not shown them that even after the cutting, even with his wolf grieving in the dark, he had been the one who signed the order moving Ren to the lower wing. He had been the one who let the council strip the silver mantle from her shoulders. He had been the one who dismissed her at the table while 3 people starved. And tonight, with his own mouth, in front of every soul in this garden, he had been the one to say the words. I reject your claim upon my wolf. Vivienne had put the blade in the wound, but he had kept silent while it bled. He had built the walls she only had to walk through. The first cut had been hers. The second had been his fear. And the third had been his own voice. An hour ago, beneath this very moon, Vivienne saw the dilemma in his face and she made one last reach for him. "Say it later, then," she whispered, only for him, stepping close. "When the northern alphas hear the cage turned its judgment on you instead of her. When they call your reign bewitched. When they demand her death to prove you still hold your own crown. You speak of guilt now because the moon has made theater of you. But tomorrow the crown will teach you other words." Her eyes glistened, and for one breath she looked almost sincere. "I only ever wanted you to survive this. Let me help you survive it now." Roman looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the woman who had stolen his mate out of his own senses, and who had done it, in part, because she was lonely and afraid, and had been taught by men like Mercer that power was the only way to hold on to anything she loved. He did not hate her. That surprised him. What he felt was sadder and colder than hate. "If I was too weak to protect her," he said, "then stealing her out of my own memory did not make me strong. It made all of you my weakness, wearing a different name." He shook his head slowly. "I will not buy back my pride with the rest of her ruin. I have spent enough of her already." And then Roman Cain reached up and took the silver crown off his head. The whole garden seemed to tilt. Mercer lunged a step forward, his soft voice cracking. "My king, do not, you cannot. The houses will." Roman threw the crown into the snow. It landed at the edge of the silver circle, beneath the pulsing severed thread, its points sinking into the frost. The lanterns caught it and threw cold light off its surface, and it lay there, small and bright and abandoned, a thing of metal at the feet of something far older. "I rejected her before this court," Roman said, and his voice carried now, clear and unhidden, to every terrace and every banner. "So before this court, I will answer for it, without the crown, because the crown is exactly what taught me to be afraid of her." His wolf shadow stepped forward behind him and lowered its scarred muzzle nearly to the snow. The beast bowed, and the man stayed standing. But the meaning was plain to every wolf in the garden. The wolf had bowed first. The man would not hide behind it any longer. Vivienne closed her eyes. She understood in that moment that she had lost him, not to Ren, to the truth. And so she did the only thing left to a woman who had built her whole future on another woman's erasure, and now had to watch that future come apart in silver light. She lifted one trembling hand to her own throat. There, beneath the fall of her white cloak, a pale mark had opened in her skin, faint and curved, like a false wound that had been waiting all this time to be seen. The court gasped, because they could see now what she had done. She had not simply cut the bond and thrown the scent away. She had kept it. She had pressed Ren's stolen scent against her own throat and worn it, season after season, so that the king's clouded wolf would catch the ghost of his mate on her and be soothed, be confused, be slowly turned. "Take it then," Vivienne said, and she dug her nails into the false mark and tore. The garden filled with a sound like silk ripping underwater. Silver scent light spilled out of her skin, pale and living, and it carried with it the smell of rain on bloodwood leaves, of crushed winter herbs, of wood smoke from 100 village hearths, of the quiet warmth that Wren Hale had once carried into every cold room she entered. Roman staggered as it struck him. His wolf shadow threw back its scarred head and howled, and the howl was not rage this time. It was recognition. The scent light flew across the garden, drawn like a tide toward the sleeping woman in the cage, and it sank back down into her, settling into the deep place it had been stolen from. And above them, the second of the 3 red cuts in the severed thread, sealed shut with a burst of silver and gold fire. Every wolf in the garden reacted at once. The alphas who had knelt before now knelt again, but this time their faces filled not with compulsion, but with shock. Because they could smell it now. They could all smell it. The thing the crescent blade had hidden from them for so long. Wren Hale was not false. She had never been false. She had only been hidden. And inside the open cage, Wren opened her eyes. The silver stars dimmed gently around her, like dawn retreating into the first breath of morning. She was cold to the bone and aching, and her own scent had come rushing back into her like blood into a sleeping limb, sharp and almost painful. For a moment she did not understand where she was. Then she saw him, Roman, standing beyond the opened bars, crownless, one hand pressed to his chest. His wolf shadow bowed low behind him with grief pouring out of its moonlit eyes, and between them, in the silver air, one last red cut still pulsed in the thread. The third one, his. But before she could speak, the constellation above her shifted one final time. The stars pulled together over the abandoned crown in the snow, and a new vision bloomed, and this one was not of Vivian, and not of Mercer. It was of Roman, asleep in a chamber of dark stone, his crown set aside, his face young and unguarded in rest, and beside the bed, on a low table, a basin of moonlit water, and a single small black vial. Inside that vial glowed a thread of pure gold, not Wren's scent, not the bond Vivian had cut. Something older, something deeper. The constellation spoke once more, soft and cold, and its words fell over the whole frozen garden like the first warning of a much larger storm. The bond was stolen. The scent was stolen. But the first theft was the memory of the choosing. Wren felt the breath leave her, and high above the fortress, beyond the black trees, something in the old council tower began, very faintly, to wake. The crown should have stayed in the snow. That was what Wren thought, in the first slow moment of it. A crown was only metal. He had thrown it down at the edge of the silver circle, and it should have lain there, cold and forgotten, while the moon finished what it had come to do. Instead, it began to rise. She felt the air change before she saw it. That same thickening she had felt long ago in the bloodwood forest, the pressure that came before lightning. The hairs lifted along her arms. The scent of the garden curdled, the clean cold turning to something scorched and old, like ash that had been kept burning far past its time. The silver crown lifted off the frost, and as it rose, it changed. The bright metal darkened, going from silver to a deep and lightless black. The smooth points lengthened, curling, sharpening, until they were no longer the points of a crown, but the bared teeth of a thing that had learned to bite. And deep inside the rim, where a head would sit, a cold black fire kindled and began to burn. Every wolf in the garden snarled at once, not in challenge, in pain. Roman went rigid. He knew this. Not the shape of it. He had never seen the crown wake before. But he knew the feeling that came off it, because he had carried that feeling inside himself his whole life, and called it duty. It was the fear of every king who had ever sat the throne before him. The fear of being moved, of being softened, of loving the wrong person too much to do the cold thing the crown required. He had felt it the night he signed the order moving Ren to the lower wing. He had felt it at the council table while 3 people starved. He had felt it an hour ago in this garden with the word rejection in his mouth. The crown was made of that fear. Generations of it, pressed together and hardened. Every emergency decree and every severed bond and every survival oath signed by every frightened king who had decided that love was a thing a ruler could not afford. And now it had woken. And it had turned its black and burning mouth toward the woman in the cage. The crown spoke. It did not have one voice. It had hundreds, layered, male, ancient, a chorus of dead kings speaking through a single throat of fire. The rejected Luna must be erased before dawn. The words rolled across the garden, and the court shrank back from them, and Mercer fell to his knees in the snow with his hands over his ears. The crown remembers what love destroys. Roman stepped in front of the cage. He put his own body between the black crown and the woman behind the bars, and he raised his arm, and his wolf shadow rose with him, enormous and scarred and grieving. "You will not touch her," he said. "Move aside," the crown answered, in the voices of all the men who had worn it. "You are the crown. The crown is you. You have always known what she costs. Finish what you began an hour ago, and the throne survives." Inside the cage, Ren got to her feet. It cost her everything she had. Her legs shook. The cold had gone so deep into her that her own body felt like a borrowed coat. But she rose, one hand against the opened bars, and she looked at the black crown, and she understood something the dead kings did not want her to understand. It hated her. But not because she was weak. It hated her because she had made weakness visible in a king. She had stood at a council table and tried to turn the whole machinery of the realm with nothing but a ledger and a soft, certain voice. She had been right when it was inconvenient. She had loved a king until he forgot how to be cold. She was not the danger because she was false. She was the danger because she was true. And true things in a place built on careful lies are the most dangerous things there are. Roman. Her voice was hoarse, but it carried. The vial. He turned his head a fraction, not taking his eyes from the crown. What? The first theft. She pressed her palm flat against the silver bars, and the last red cut in the thread between them pulsed under her hand. The constellation showed it. Before they cut the bond. Before they stole the scent. They took something else from you first. Her eyes found his. They took the moment you chose me, and high above the garden, drawn down out of the council tower by the waking of the crown, a small black vial came floating through the cold air, turning slowly, a thread of pure gold glowing within it. Roman looked at it, and his whole face changed. He did not remember choosing her. He had never let himself look at that directly. He remembered finding her in the forest. He remembered the blood and the pup and his wolf lowering its head. He remembered all the events of that night, laid out in order like stones on a path. But the certainty was gone from them. He remembered finding her. He did not remember choosing her. He had spent the whole long season since unable to feel why his wolf had bowed, only that it had, and that absence had made it so easy to believe the bond was false. You cannot fight for a choice you cannot remember making. They had not just cut the bond. They had reached into him while he slept and carved out the very first moment, the root of all of it, so that everything that grew afterward could always, always be questioned. The vial drifted lower between him and the cage, and the black crown lunged for it. Wren moved before she could think. She reached through the opened bars, and her hand closed around the small black vial just ahead of the crown's burning teeth. The cold of the glass shocked her. The gold thread inside flared at her touch, recognizing her, reaching for her. "Roman," she said, "come here." He crossed to the bars in 2 strides, and the crown shrieked behind him in its 100 dead voices, and Wren held the vial up between them, the gold light painting both their faces. "This is yours," she said. "It was taken from you. You can take it back." Her eyes held his, but not the way Mercer took it from you. Not torn out while you sleep. Not alone. She swallowed. "If this comes back, it comes back because you choose it. With your eyes open, with me watching. So no one can ever tell you again that you did not mean it." His hand came up and closed over hers, around the vial. "Together," he said, rough, certain. The first certain thing he had said in a season. Together. The glass shattered between their palms. The memory did not come back gently. It tore through Roman like a wolf breaking through river ice. He fell to one knee in the snow, his hand still pressed to hers, his breath caught hard in his chest. His wolf shadow reared up behind him, and the silver scars across its muzzle blazed white, and then, one by one, began to close. And he saw it. He saw the bloodwood clearing as he had truly seen it that night, not as a set of events, but as a feeling. He saw a wounded stranger choose a dying creature over her own last breath. He felt the exact moment his wolf had bowed, and he finally understood why. It had not bowed to her power. She had none. It had not bowed to her blood. She was no one by the cold arithmetic of the court. It had bowed to her mercy, to the thing in her that looked at something small and broken and decided it mattered anyway. His wolf, which had been raised to believe that only strength was worth kneeling to, had found in her a different kind of strength entirely, and it had recognized it as home. That was the choosing. That was the root they had carved out of him. And Wren felt it return through the bars, through their joined hands, the whole warm gold flood of it. And the tears came at last, because she had spent a whole season being told she was a thing he had been tricked into. And here, finally, was the truth. He had not been tricked into her. He had chosen her freely before anyone told him not to. The last red cut in the thread flared white, and it began, slowly, to close. But it did not finish. Wren felt it stop, an inch from healing, the gold light trembling, refusing to seal, and she understood why. The first 2 cuts had been other hands. Vivian's blade, Mercer's ash. Those could be undone by returning what was stolen. But the 3rd cut was his. His fear. His silence. His own voice in this garden, an hour ago. And the constellation, hanging silver and patient above them, would not let that one heal on a returned memory alone. Confession could begin it. But something more would be needed to finish it. The black crown rose up over them, vast now, swollen on the fear it had been feeding on for generations. and the cold black fire poured out of its rim and lashed toward the cage like a whip made of grief. Roman surged to his feet. His wolf shadow met the fire, throwing itself between the crown and the woman behind the bars, and the black flame tore across its fur. And Roman staggered, blood slipping from his nose. But he did not let go of the connection. He held the beast there by will alone, shaking, bleeding, refusing to move. "Ren," he gasped. "Close it. The bond. Close it now." She knew what he meant. If she let the last cut seal, the bond between them would come back whole. His wolf would be stronger. The two of them, mated and joined, might be able to stand against the crown where one of them alone could not. It would save them. It would be so easy. She had only to want it, and Ren Hale, standing in the wreckage of the prison that had been built to destroy her, with the man she loved bleeding to protect her, and a crown of dead kings reaching down to erase her, said no. She stepped out of the cage, onto the frozen stone, barefoot, into the open garden, and she walked to Roman's side, not behind him, beside him, close enough that her shoulder nearly touched his arm, far enough that the choice was clearly her own. "No," she said again, quiet, just for him. He turned his head, the strain white in his face. "Ren, it will kill you. Maybe." Her voice did not shake. "But if I close this bond now, in this moment, with that thing over our heads, then I close it because I was afraid, because I was threatened, because it was the only way to survive." She looked up at the black crown, at the cold fire, at the 100 dead kings who had decided love was a weakness a throne could not afford. And that is exactly what they have always done. Every one of them. They made love a thing you do because you have to. A thing you cut or keep or close because of what it costs the crown. Her hand found his, scarred palm to scarred palm. "I will not love you because I am cornered," she said. "I would rather die honest than live as one more emergency." For one breath, the whole garden held still. And then something extraordinary happened to the silver light. The constellation above them, which had hung silver and watching this whole long night, blazed up at her words, brighter than the moon. The stars rushed down out of the sky and gathered around the two of them, not as a weapon, not as a cage, but as a witness, a dome of soft and living light. The black crown poured its fire against it, and the fire did not burn. It turned instead into images, everything the crown had ever tried to bury. Ren stripped of her mantle, Ren kneeling beneath the cage, Roman speaking the rejection, Vivian cutting the scent, Mercer carrying the ash, the starving villages ignored, and underneath all of it, women through long generations waking beside husbands their wolves had never chosen, men whose beasts mourned mates they had been made to forget, all of it cut and hidden and called wisdom. The crown had meant to turn memory into shame. Ren turned it into witness. "Look," she said. And this time, the command did not go to the court. It went to Roman. He looked, not because the magic forced him, because he chose to. He stood there bleeding into the snow, his wolf shadow shaking against the black fire, and he made himself look at every moment the crown wanted him to be ashamed of. He saw himself sign the order. He saw himself walk past her in the corridor with the ledger in her arms. He saw her face after the rejection, upright, refusing to break for the satisfaction of the watching court. He saw, finally and fully, every place where he had felt the truth and chosen not to follow it, and he did not look away. "I rejected her," he said, and his voice rang out across the garden, steady now, stripped of the crown and everything the crown had taught him. Not the counsel, not the prophecy, not the stolen scent. Me. I spoke the words. I gave my fear my own mouth. He lifted his face to the black crown. "And I revoke the law that ever made my fear holy." The crown screamed, and the third cut in the thread blazed white, and this time it sealed. Not because Ren had closed it under threat, because he had finally answered for the wound himself, with his eyes open, with no crown on his head, and nothing left to hide behind. The bond healed, whole and gold and singing, and it healed as a thing freely chosen by both of them, in the open, before the moon. The dome of silver light flared. Roman's wolf, no longer scarred, no longer grieving, gathered itself and leapt, not as a beast of conquest, as a king's wolf finally seeing clearly for the first time in a long, blind season. It seized the black crown between its jaws, and the black fire tore across it, and Roman staggered, but Ren put her hand flat against his chest and poured her strength into him through the healed and singing bond. And he held. The crown cracked down the center. Through the fracture poured everything it had hoarded. Names, old vows, lost sense, first choices, last regrets. The emergency laws burned away in the cold air like dry leaves thrown on a fire. And then the crown shattered, not into pieces, into wolves. Hundreds of silver wolf shadows burst out of the broken relic, and they raced through the garden and out across the frozen kingdom, each one carrying a stolen bond back toward the living or the dead who had once held it. Some would heal, some would only grieve, but none of them would stay buried in the dark any longer. Mercer dropped flat against the snow as the last of them passed over him. The old counselor lay there, gray and broken, the thing that had protected him for so long now gone, scattered into 100 running shadows. He did not rise. Vivienne Thorne stood at the edge of the judgment stairs, her throat bare where the stolen scent had been torn free, watching the sky fill with the evidence of everything she had been only one small blade inside of. The black fire was gone. The garden went quiet, and the constellation slowly lowered until it hung above the opened cage like a calm and patient sky. No longer a weapon, no longer a prison, only silver light against the paling dark. Ren swayed. Roman caught her, but only after she leaned toward him first. That mattered. It would always matter now. He gathered her carefully against his chest, the way a man holds something he has been given back and does not intend to lose again. And she let her head rest there, listening to the steady, frightened, living beat of his heart. The bond between them sang whole and gold, but she did not speak of it yet. There was still a kingdom to answer to, still villages in the dark, still a dawn coming that would ask hard questions of a crownless king and the woman the moon had refused to condemn. Above them, the last of the silver wolves vanished over the black trees, and the first thin light of morning touched the edge of the frozen garden, where a king stood holding his mate among the ruins of every lie that had been built to keep them apart. Dawn came slowly to the judgment garden. It came the way healing comes after a long fever, gray at first, uncertain, the light leaking in low over the black trees and turning the snow from silver to the palest blue. The full moon faded toward the western edge of the sky, But the constellation the cage had made still hung faintly overhead, a map of wolves and threads and returned names, refusing quite to vanish into morning. Wren Hale stood in the middle of it all. She was wrapped in the king's heavy cloak now, the one he had pulled from his own shoulders the moment she began to shiver. And it carried his scent, wood smoke and snow, the same scent that had once soaked into the wool the night he carried her out of the forest. Her bare feet had gone numb against the stone. Her whole body ached as though she had been pulled apart and put back together by hands that were not quite sure of the order. The bond sang inside her, whole, gold, real again. And still she did not feel finished, because a healed thread, she was learning, is not the same thing as a healed life. The court had not left. They stood in the cold gray light, lords and ladies both, and Wren could feel them watching her with a new kind of attention. The contempt was gone. So was the fear. What had replaced it was something almost worse. Hunger of a different shape. She knew that look. She had felt it the first morning the servants began to bow. It was the look of people deciding where to put her now that she had proven inconvenient to throw away. The moon had defended her. The bond had returned. And so the court was already, quietly, beginning to reach for her again. Make her Luna. Make her queen. Make her a symbol of the king's restored strength. A story to tell the northern houses. A warm and useful shape to fill the cold space the scandal had opened. A new cage. This one made of honor instead of silver. But a cage all the same. Roman stood a few steps away, crownless, blood dried beneath his nose, watching her with an expression she had no name for. He had not tried to touch her since she leaned away to stand on her own. He had not tried to speak for her. He had simply stayed close enough to catch her if she fell, and far enough to leave the falling, and the not falling, entirely her choice. It was, she thought, the most respectful thing he had ever done. It did not undo the rest, but she noticed it. "You remember me now," she said. It was not a question, and it landed harder than any accusation could have, because he flinched as though she had struck him, and the whole court went still to hear his answer. "Yes," Roman said quietly. "You remember the forest, the pup, your wolf bowing in the snow." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. "You remember the herb room, the things you said to me there. You remember the bond they cut out of you while you slept." "Yes." "Then answer me one thing, with all of it remembered." She looked at him steadily, and the dawn light caught the unshed tears in her eyes, and did not let them fall. "When no one's blade was in your hand, when no spell clouded you, when it was only you, and a piece of paper, and a choice, what did you do?" The garden held its breath. Roman did not look away from her. She would give him that. Whatever else he had failed at, he did not look away now. "When they moved you from the upper wing," he said, "I signed the order." "Yes." "When they took the silver mantle from your shoulders and called it temporary, I stood beside the council, and I said nothing." "Yes." "When you brought me the ledger, when you stood at my table and begged me to send the grain before the roads closed and the children starved." His voice cracked, and he let it. "I told you the matter would be reviewed. And 3 people died. A child you had healed with your own hands." "Yes," Wren said softly. "Say her into the morning, Roman." She had a name. He closed his eyes for one breath. Then he opened them, and he said the child's name, and the young mother's, and the old man's, the three of them, out loud, in front of the whole court, so that the names would not be lost the way the bonds had nearly been lost. It was the first time the court had heard them spoken, and several of the lords looked at the snow. And last night, Wren said, in this garden, with everyone watching, I rejected you. His jaw worked. Out of fear, not law, not the prophecy, not the moon's will. He drew a breath that shook. I told myself the bond was false because that was easier than wondering why losing you felt like losing the only honest part of me. I let them call my fear wisdom. I let them call your gentleness a danger. And when the moment came, I gave my fear my own mouth, and I cast you out, and I would have let this cage burn your name out of the world to make my cruelty look holy. The words fell into the cold air and stayed there. An alpha king was allowed his anger, his pride, his vengeance, even his grief, if it was dressed up well enough for ceremony, but fear, spoken plainly, with no crown to soften it, that was a kind of nakedness the court did not know what to do with. Several of the lords shifted, uneasy, as though he had opened a wound they all preferred to pretend their kind did not carry. Wren saw it, and she understood in that moment that this was the real transformation. Not the bond healing, not the crown shattering. This, a king who had learned to say the true thing out loud, even when it cost him the armor. But understanding was not the same as forgiveness. The thread between us is whole again, Wren said. I felt it close last night. I chose to let it close because you finally chose me with your eyes open. She paused. But hear me, Roman, and let the whole court hear me too. A healed bond is not a healed trust. The moon proved I was not false. It did not prove that I am ready to stand at your side as though none of this had happened. I know, he said, they will want to crown me by nightfall. She glanced at the watching court, at the hunger in their faces, and her voice hardened. They will want to make me Luna, make me queen, make me the proof that everything is mended. They will hand me a new mantle and call it an honor. And it will be the same cage, the same hands that locked me in silver, reaching to lock me in gold. I will not let them. You will not let them, Wren repeated. And for the first time, the ghost of something almost like a smile touched her mouth. Listen to yourself. You will not let them, as though it is yours to allow. She shook her head slowly. That is the whole sickness of this place. Whether I am caged or crowned, the choice keeps belonging to everyone but me. The court was silent. I will decide what I become, Wren said. Not the moon, not the council, not the prophecy, and not you. For Roman, each word was a blade he had earned and chose to stand beneath. He had spent his whole reign believing that strength meant deciding things for people, deciding what the realm needed, deciding which loves were too costly, deciding in the end that the woman his own wolf had chosen was a danger to be managed. And here she stood, barefoot in his cloak, having survived the cage he had sent her to, telling him that the most powerful thing he could do now was to stop deciding for her. It went against everything the crown had taught him, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep and quiet in his chest, that she was right. So he did the only thing he could think of to prove He had heard her. He turned away from her, and he went to work. He faced the court without his crown. "Every severance law is ended," he said, and his voice carried now, clear and cold and certain, across the whole frozen garden. "Tonight, not when the council finds time. Now, no bond will be cut by decree again. No mate will be carved out of a sleeping wolf and the wound called stability. What was done in this kingdom for generations, in the dark, is over." A northern alpha stepped forward, his face dark with anger. "And when the houses rebel," the alpha said, "when the old families learn their ancient law is gone, when the treaties built on those marriages come apart, what then? You would unmake the kingdom for the sake of one healer and a sky full of ghosts." Roman looked at the man for a long moment. This was the test. Wren could see it. This was the place where the old Roman would have reached for her, would have used her, would have said something like, "She is my true Luna, and the moon has blessed her, and made her the shield." He hid the decision behind. He did not reach for her. "A throne that needs stolen love to stand," Roman said, "deserves to learn how to fall." He let that land. "If the houses rebel, then they rebel against the truth, and I will meet them as a king who finally has nothing to hide. But I will not buy their loyalty with another woman's silence, not hers, not anyone's, not ever again." The cost of it was real. Wren watched it move through the gathered lords, the shock, the calculation, the first cracks of a kingdom that would now have to be held together by something harder than fear. He had just made his own reign smaller, weaker by every measure the court understood. He had traded the easy power of the old law for the brutal, slow work of earning loyalty without it. And he had done it without using her name once. Then he turned to the matter that could not wait for any of it. "The grain," he said. "Every wagon in the noble stores. It goes down to the villages before this morning is out. The roads are closing. People are starving while it sits in our cellars." His eyes swept the lords whose storehouses they were. "It was taxed out of their mouths to fill ours. It will be carried back into their hands by the same families who took it. Personally, so that they see the faces of the people they nearly let die." It was not a grand gesture. It was grain, wagons, cold work in the cold, hands blistering on frozen ropes. And that was exactly why it mattered. Wren had spent her whole life among people who measured a man not by what he declared in a warm hall, but by whether the help arrived before the roads closed. Words were cheap. Words had always been cheap. Roman could have stood in this garden and apologized to her until the snow melted, and it would have meant less than one wagon of grain reaching one village in time. He knew that now. She could see that he knew it. And something in her, some small frozen thing that had been clenched tight since the night 3 people died for being inconvenient, loosened by the smallest degree. That left Vivian. She stood under guard at the edge of the judgment stairs, her crescent bracelet broken in the snow, her throat bare of the scent she had stolen and worn so long. Her beauty had not left her, but the composure had. She watched Wren approach with the look of a woman standing in the ruins of the only future she had ever let herself want. "Will you have me executed?" Vivian asked. She asked it almost calmly, as though death were the simplest of the options, and perhaps, for her, the kindest. "No," Wren said. Vivian's jaw tightened. "You think That is mercy. No. Ren looked at her steadily. I think death would let you become simpler than what you did. A villain on a scaffold. A tidy ending the court could tell itself a clean story about. She shook her head. You do not get to be simple. You will live. You will testify. You will sit before the whole pack and say out loud every name you helped erase, every bond you helped cut, every door you held open while a king's mate was carved out of his sleep. You will be the witness, Vivienne, not the martyr. For the first time, something cracked in Vivienne's face that was not anger. He would have destroyed himself for me, she said, low. If you had never come, he would have needed me. I made myself necessary because no one ever chose me. Do you understand? I took your scent because being loved was never offered to me, only being useful. Ren was quiet for a moment. She did not soften, but she did not sharpen either. I understand it, she said. You were lonely and afraid, and men like Mercer taught you that power was the only thing that could not be taken away from you the way love could. Her voice was tired and honest and without cruelty. And then you decided I should pay for what you were never given. That is the part I cannot forgive, not the loneliness, the choice you made with it. She held Vivienne's eyes. He should have been allowed to choose. So should I. You took that from both of us, because someone took it from you. The chain stops here, with you, in the witness chair, saying the truth out loud, until the kingdom cannot pretend anymore. Vivienne looked away first. It was, in the end, the only victory either of them would get. Mercer was led away in silence. The old counselor did not plead. The thing that had protected him for so long was gone, scattered into 100 running silver wolves, and without it, he was only what he had always been underneath. A frightened man who had decided long ago that the suffering of the powerless was a reasonable price for the comfort of the powerful. The council that had deferred to him stood stripped and exposed in the gray morning. They would not rule this kingdom the way they had ruled it before. That, too, was the transformation. And then the court turned back to Ren, because there it was again, the old hunger, the need to place her. Now that the law was ended and the grain was moving and the villains were bound, the kingdom needed its happy shape, its restored Luna, its proof that the wound had closed. The Northern Alpha spoke it aloud. And her, he said, nodding toward Ren. Is she Luna now? Is she queen? The court must know what she is. The garden went still, and Ren understood that this was the last cage, the final one, the kindest looking and most dangerous of them all. False mate, true mate, threat, queen, symbol, every one of them a name chosen by someone else for what she was useful as. Roman opened his mouth, and then he closed it. He looked at her, and she watched him visibly stop himself from answering for her, watched the effort it cost him, and then he simply said, to the court, "She will tell you what she is. It was never ours to name." Ren walked forward. She walked to where the silver crown still lay in the snow, where Roman had thrown it the night before. It had not transformed. It had not shattered. It was only metal again, cold and bright and waiting, the way crowns always wait. Once she had dreamed of wearing the mantle of this place, of standing beside him beneath the banners, healing the kingdom from the warmth of his trust. Now the crown looked less like a promise. It looked like a question made of metal. She stopped beside it, She looked down at it for a long moment. The whole court watched to see what she would do. Pick it up, push it away, crush it underfoot, the way a wronged woman in a story is supposed to. She did none of those things. She lifted her bare foot, and she stepped over it. Not on it. Over it. And the court understood the insult and the restraint of it both at once. She would not crush the crown to make them feel her anger, and she would not take it up to make them feel comfortable. She simply stepped over it, the way you step over a thing that no longer has any power to stop you. And she walked on. She stopped in front of Roman. The healed bond hummed between them, gold and quiet and alive. Close enough now that she could see the grief still in his eyes, the blood dried beneath his nose, the way he held himself very still, as though one wrong breath might frighten her away. "I do not forgive you this morning," she said. His face tightened, but he nodded. "I know. I will not return because your wolf remembers me. And I will not become Luna because the moon proved I was not false." She let the words settle. Those were never proofs of love. They were only proofs that I was wronged. They are not the same thing, and I will not let this court pretend they are. "No," he said, rough. "They are not. I am going to stay." She watched the hope rise in him, and she held it gently, carefully, the way she held all fragile living things. "But not as your reward for finally seeing me. I am going to witness the bonds that came home last night and help the ones I can. I am going to speak for the villages, the way I tried to before. Except this time you are going to listen, because you have learned what it costs when you do not." A breath. The dawn brightening behind the black trees. "And whether this bond becomes a life," she said, "whether I stand beside you one day as something more than the woman this court condemned and the moon defended, that is mine to decide, slowly, in my own time. Watching not what you say in a garden full of witnesses, but what you do on the cold, ordinary mornings when no one is watching at all." Roman was quiet for a long moment. Then a faint, painful, hopeful thing touched the corner of his mouth. "Then I will wait," he said. "No." And here, at last, something in Ren that had been bracing for a whole lifetime let go. "You will work." He bowed his head. "Yes," he said, "I will work." The first full light of morning broke over the judgment garden. The moon faded entirely, but the constellation the cage had made stayed faintly visible against the brightening sky, a map of silver wolves and restored threads, watching over the place where a woman had been brought to be erased and had refused, with her whole stubborn heart, to disappear. Ren turned toward the opened cage. The silver bars that had been built to imprison her had unfolded into stars, and now they lowered gently around her, not closing, not trapping, but bowing outward into a wide crescent of light at her back. No throne behind her, no prison, only a sky. She stood beneath it, barefoot in a king's cloak, and she felt the truth of it settle into her bones. They had stolen her bond. They had stolen her scent. They had stolen the king's first memory of choosing her, and tried to steal her name, and her dignity, and her place in the world. But they had not been able to keep any of it, because worth, real worth, the kind she had carried into every cold room and every dying village and every clearing full of snow, was never theirs to grant in the first place. And so, It was never theirs to take. They could hide it. They could cut it. They could lock it in silver and call it a lie. And still, in the end, the moon itself had refused to condemn her. She had refused to condemn herself. Behind her, Roman lifted his eyes to the fading constellation, to the kingdom waking slowly to the truth he had feared his whole life, and the moon cage, which had been built to prove a woman had lied, which had hung for generations as a throne for the powerful and a grave for the inconvenient, did not become a throne that morning. It became a sky, open, wide, holding nothing in, and under it, for the first time, a woman stood exactly as much herself as she had always been. And finally, in the clear, cold light of an ordinary dawn, was allowed to be seen.